Hello and good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for Deep Roots Native Plant webinar. My name is Sydney Ross and I'll be your host today. We have a fabulous show joined by guest experts Shannon Tyree and Larry Rizzo of Habitat Architects. Today, we'll be discussing 10 years of land restoration of woodlands, prairies, and more in western Olathe on a 240-acre parcel of land that this team has been stewarding for several years now. But before we begin, I just have a couple announcements to make. Thanks to our sponsors, Johnson County Park and Recreation District and Missouri Department of Conservation, for protecting fish, forest, and wildlife resources and connecting people to nature in their backyards and beyond. Tune in each first and third Thursday for our Deep Roots Native Plant webinars, where we cover both small and large landscapes across Kansas and Missouri. If you missed any of our previous episodes, like our tree pruning with MDC urban forester Taylor Neff, you can visit our website at deeproots.org to view our archive or visit us online on our YouTube channel. If you'd like to join me in person, we have our Discover Native Gardening sessions in the greenhouse taking place both this month and in March. This is a time where you can learn seasonal skills, feel empowered, and enjoy camaraderie. We're currently growing a couple thousand of native plants for the Anita B. Gorman Conservation Discovery Center's Go Native event later in April. So if you'd like to learn how to grow native plants from seed successfully and get them ready for your garden this spring and fall, join us. You can sign up for free online at deeproots.org. Our Deep Roots Native Plant Sale is Saturday, April 12th, the first of many in our series this year. We will be in Prairie Village. This is in coordination with our Habitat Garden Tours, which is a really fun way to view different gardens across the city, get inspired, and add native plants into your own landscape. Information for both our plant sale and Habitat Garden Tours can be found online. We're also seeking volunteers to help with our Habitat Garden Tours, which is a great opportunity to get some behind the scenes looks at these gardens, meet the gardeners who are stewarding these landscapes, and have fun. Find out more information at deeproots.org/habitatgardens. I want to personally thank those who attended our 2025 Planet Native Landscapes Conference. We had a ton of fun at the Discovery Center and Kauffman Foundation, learning from landscape experts across the region. Special thanks to our Burr Oak sponsors, the Muriel McBrien Kauffman Family Foundation, Missouri Department of Conservation, Izell Native Plants, and the Miller Hammond Charitable Fund for making this year's Planet Native a smashing success. As always, this webinar will be recorded and all resources will be available online. Following today's episode, I will send you personally an email with links and information from today's show. Don't forget, put your comments in the chat. It's been fun to hear where folks are tuning in from. Everywhere from Salem, Missouri, to Raytown, to Leawood, even some folks in Florida, which I'm very jealous of right now with our cold temps here in the Midwest. So let us know where you're tuning in from in the chat and put your questions in the Q&A. At the end of our session today, we'll be joined for our live Q&A session with our guest experts, Shannon Tyree and Larry Rizzo. Following today's program, please visit us online at deeproots.org for more information on upcoming events, webinars, native gardening resources, and how you can get involved. While you're there, consider making a donation. Okay, I'd like to go ahead and welcome to the virtual stage our guest experts from Habitat Architects, Shannon Tyree and Larry Rizzo. Shannon is the president and owner of Habitat Architects, LLC, and a restoration ecologist with more than 28 years of experience. His background includes project management, wetland delineations, Section 404 permits, field site inventories, habitat restoration design and construction, vegetation assessments, threatened and endangered species surveys, ecological monitoring, habitat evaluations, and NEPA documentation. Larry Rizzo is retired from a career in the Missouri Department of Conservation, serving the last 20 years as a natural history biologist in the Kansas City region. During his career, Larry placed special emphasis on identifying and managing biologically diverse natural communities in the urban area, leading to the creation of Kansas City Wildlands. This organization was created some 25 years ago and is part of Bridging the Gap, a local nonprofit that we work with regularly. Today, semi-retired, Larry works as a biologist for Habitat Architects, still performing natural resource stewardship and killing lots of bad plants. Welcome, Larry and Shannon. We're so excited to have you joining us today.
Thank you, Sydney.
Wonderful. Let's see here. All right, you guys. So I know we're in winter time, but are there any exciting projects up on the horizon that you're looking forward to?
We're looking forward to getting outdoors, which haven't done a lot of here recently.
Yeah, I bet.
Yeah, we've actually, we're doing a bat restoration project in Hannibal. So we've been doing an exciting project over the winter time, um, creating some additional foraging habitat for bats in that Sodalis Nature Park. Of course, that park has about a third of the world's population of Indiana bats, so it's kind of neat. There's a old quarry there with a bunch of caves, about 35 miles of caves, I guess, underneath. It goes under the Mississippi River, and it's kind of fun. And then by now we should have already transitioned into seeding, but the weather hasn't really allowed for a whole lot of drill seeding. But we have a lot of that on our plate coming up as soon as the ground's dry enough to do so.
That's really exciting. I'm especially excited to hear not only about your drill seeding projects coming up, but especially the bat habitat restoration. Do you all ever besides, protecting bat habitat, do you go exploring caves in Missouri in general, like when you go out camping or floating on the river?
Oh, of course.
I do. I do a
Especially
little
if
bit.
you're not supposed to go there, definitely go in there. So no, that's yeah, no, we always do that. We have trouble on each project getting sidetracked, and everybody wanders off doing botany or bird surveys, Larry. So yeah, we're easily distracted. We're biologists, so staying on task is the hard part.
You all are my favorite kind of people. Well, we have an awesome show for you all today. Along with my team at Deep Roots, we got to join Larry and Shannon and their team from Habitat Architects out in Western Olathe. So today's program is going to show a field trip we took back in September of last year. So lucky for us, we'll have some blooms and some foliage to check out in today's program. And I encourage you all to stick around till the end and make sure you put your land management questions in the Q&A for Shannon and Larry to answer live at the end of today's program. Okay, guys, let's go ahead and get started. And we've got a wonderful program for you all. Thanks for joining us for our Deep Roots Native Plant webinar.
My name's Shannon Tyree, and I'm the president and co-owner of Habitat Architects. I'm a restoration ecologist. We're standing on one of the prairies that we've been restoring for the past 10 years or so. Today, just ahead of a Deep Roots field trip to kind of tour and show off the place. We're pretty excited. It's September, so a lot of things are in bloom. Some of our flowers are gone, but the fall foliage is in full swing, so we'll see a couple things that are pretty exciting. We have an eared false foxglove population here that's probably the entire state of Missouri. So if this was in Missouri, it'd be the largest population in the state, and this happened because nature. We didn't do anything. We removed the cedars, gave it a year to wait and see what was going to happen, and this is really what happened. We haven't done anything but burn it and maintain it and do some invasive species management, but this was here under the cedars all along. So it's pretty fun to show it off. We're excited about it later today when we get to show 20 or so people and show them what we do. It's out in the middle of nowhere. We're close to DeSoto and Kill Creek Park, so it's kind of fun to bring people out because we're here all the time. It's our favorite place to work, but nobody ever gets to see it. So you get this beautiful prairie that nobody ever gets to see. So we like to show it off when we can. This was the first target area. One of the first places that caught my eye whenever I came through, like I said, 12 years ago, was this spot right in here. For my initial field visit here was just to do kind of a site assessment and kind of vegetation assessment, if you will. Just did a map and a small report that said, here's oak hickory woodland, this is pasture, whatever, just very generic. And that resulted in kind of a list of things that could be done to improve the property. We do these a lot, kind of very basic habitat assessment for landowners. And in this case, the landowner asked, hey, can you do that prairie restoration? So we said, sure. So it started from there and led to, just snowballed one after the other to the point, like we'd mentioned now, we're kind of full-scale land managers on the property and kind of get to do a lot of what we want as long as we keep the landowner and informed of what we're doing. So that's how we got here. This is one of the woodlands that when I very first got here identified because of the oak hickory composition, and it's just really sharp. Again, it had buckbrush probably up to waist high, and it was really, really thick. We have got a couple burns in here because we have enough leaf litter around the 1st of November that we got like a 2-week window where it would burn. And after that, for some reason, just too much buckbrush, it just wouldn't do it. But that little window when all the leaves come on the ground was good. And we've got about 3 burns in here now. It's been really dry, so it's a little not very impressive right now, but in the spring it's pretty phenomenal. And I don't think we can see it on our video or anything, or pictures now, but we do have pictures. You'll see where the fire had made it right to the edge, and each year it pushes 30 feet farther. And so it's a very clean line, and after we'll burn, this will all just look dead sticks everywhere, and then there's a green wall where that buckbrush is still alive. But it's really coming around. It's starting to kind of thin out too, because we've run a burn number 5 on this little piece. It's starting to thin out, so the chinkapins are doing what, they love it. Some of the other trees, they're not all that happy with getting burned every couple of years, so they're sort of fading away, but that's what we'd expect, that's what we want, and it's really, really looking good. This is very heavy chinkapin, which is really kind of neat, kind of unique. We've got rock close to the surface as well, so it kind of limits the diversity. We've got some mockernut hickory and bitternut hickory go along with it. There are some pretty good bit of the other oaks, red oaks, some white oak, quite a bit of white oak, and so it's a really nice oak hickory composition. The only thing we have to worry about is we've got hedge in places where we've girdled them, and they tend to burn after a couple years after they've died a little bit. We've come back during our mop up to find them, giant hedge on fire, and they're usually in the middle of the burn, so it doesn't care. But it's kind of neat how they burn up to nothing, and we're slowly getting rid of them. I mentioned after the burn we start seeing a lot more spring ephemeral, so I think we're seeing Dutchman's breeches, waking robin. Gosh, I'm trying to think who covers spring beauties, cover the flora. The mayaples, of course, are popping up, and we even finally did get some morels to pop up in the woods after multiple burns. But it turns out that it gets to be pretty much a carpet, especially with the spring beauty, hammers it pretty hard. There's a few other things in a green dragon that this year, I think it's even in bloom still now, that sort of came up. Not a lot you're going to find this time of year. We've got some of the woodland sunflower, like I said. Even the behind me, you'll see all of the river oats that are coming up. It's everything, like the river oats here. Everything here wasn't here. This is all stuff that we just brought in, and we hand scattered some of it around, and it's finally kind of picking up. It just gives us something to burn. It really helps with the burn, but it's really starting to turn and do well.
I'm Larry Rizzo. I work for Habitat Architects. And restoration of native plant communities is important, period, and important to me personally because, if you look at our overall landscape, the impact humans have had on it is just incalculable. The amount of disturbance that we've created in the landscape, the amount of native plant communities we've destroyed, the loss of biodiversity. So on one hand, it's kind of a responsibility I think we have to try to put back what was here and do as little harm or reverse some of the harm that we've done to the landscape. And just on a more simple level, it's fun and it's aesthetically pleasing. I mean, that's the other great thing, that we can talk about science and biodiversity and terms like that a lot, but one of the things people respond to the most is beauty. And when you're restoring a native plant community and making it more diverse, you're making it pretty as well. And that's really important. Shouldn't be overlooked as well as the science aspects of it. For starters, I always think it's important to define what we're talking about when we say woodland, because it's confusing to a lot of people, and it's a term that's used pretty generically, a lot of terms, but in Missouri, it's in particular, in Kansas, the part of the world we're in, it really refers to a very specific natural community type. And the way I always like to define it is to tell you what it's not. Okay, so if you look at a spectrum of canopy closure, we start with 0 canopy closure, which is going to be what natural community?
Prairie.
Prairies. Essentially no trees, or they should have a few trees. As we go up that continuum of canopy closure, you get to savanna, which is defined as about 10 to 30% canopy coverage. So basically prairie with scattered trees. And unfortunately, most of our visuals with that come from watching nature shows as kids, and we think of Africa. We had plenty of savanna in the Midwest, oak savanna. Okay, so from that 30% up to about 80%, that's our woodland range. So woodlands are meant to have some opening in the canopy, which allows for a nice ground flora, and they're also a fire-maintained system. All those prairie, savanna, they're all fire-maintained systems. True forest is basically closed canopy, and it's really much rarer around here than people realize. Your true forest is going to exist in bottomlands and on some of your north and east-facing slopes, the moister slopes. But unfortunately, what happens when a woodland doesn't see fire or doesn't get any management for a long time is they become more forest-like, because they get overgrown, and the more shade you have, the more moisture it's going to retain, and pretty soon it's a process that's called mesification, meaning it's just attracting more and more moisture, but eventually it's going to change the whole plant community. So you can walk into an area and, oh, this is kind of a so-so looking forest, when it's actually a very degraded woodland that needs management. And really very few of them, particularly in our area, get management or burn. Is the big thing that they need. So that's what we're doing here, and this is a good spot to appreciate the effects of the fire, because we look here, you see where we run into kind of a little change in the understory, like right there, where the buckbrush gets really super intense. There's right back here, we can see the same thing. Those are the parts where the buckbrush was at its worst, and we're still having trouble getting the fire to carry. Each fire, though, you got to be persistent with this, and that's why we burn this very aggressively. We try to burn this annually, and we probably will for a while yet. Each fire tends to push in there just a little bit farther, and pretty soon we will get it to burn. I've been involved with a woodland burn in Swope Park for better part of 25 years almost now, and there are places when we first started burning in there we couldn't make it burn. We just could not get fire to carry, and believe me, it carries now. So it takes a while, but it'll happen. Fire is always carried pretty well in here, and that's because of our oaks. This is the place, this is the area in this woodland that had the best quality oaks. So you get oaks on the ground, and you get the oak leaves that I mentioned before. When they don't break down fast, they curl up, they carry fire, and basically any oak dominated woodland is meant to burn. Another thing we've done here is introduce this very useful little grass, the river oats, which has been kind of a thing we've come upon here in the Kansas City area. Matt Garrett over in Johnson County and Kansas City Wildlands, you know, we would struggle in some cases of places where we'd remove honeysuckle very extensively to, you know, what can we put back there? And particularly if it's an area you hope to burn some eventually. We have the advantage of having some sites where we can collect some mass quantities of this seed, and we would start throwing it down, and within a few years it starts showing up and carries fire very well. It really hasn't come on as fast here as I thought it would, but it's starting to become pretty visible through here, and it's going to help us get the fire. And again, this fire builds on itself, so get this area where fire carries very well. If it's got that much more fuel to go and get a little more momentum, that's going to help it hopefully slam into some of these areas where it's not carrying very well and start pushing that back a little bit. Foresters Always had the strategy, if you wanted to get more sunlight on the ground in a place like this, what would you do? Well, you cut out these big trees. And conveniently, you can often sell them too, which of course had nothing to do with it. But but you take out canopy trees. Well, that'll get sunlight on the ground real fast, and that can be a problem. Because if you go to those sites, particularly where you do even age management, otherwise known as clear cuts, you go from full shade to full sun, and it really puts a shock into the system. And what you're going to look at in a place like that when you go back are just this ocean of tree sprouts and maybe blackberry and all this other gnarly stuff. Whereas if you burn very gradually, like I did on the property I referenced, every other year, it's kind of semi-aggressive, and you can open up canopy from the bottom up instead of the top down, because you'll start knocking out these mid-level trees and shrubs. And that does allow more sunlight on the ground, but it doesn't do it in such a shocking, sudden kind of way as taking out the mature trees. And then periodically, mature trees die, and they fall over and you get a canopy gap. And so you've got those little spots. You just don't do it over the whole area.
After learning about restoration efforts in the oak hickory dominated woodland, field trip participants hopped on gators to visit 2 prairie areas. The first, which is hayed, and the other that is regularly burned.
I always make a really big distinction between a restoration and a planting station. Nodding, she's heard this before. A restoration is something that contains an original kernel of the real thing, okay? And the analogy I always like to use was cars. If you're restoring a 65 Mustang, you better start with some part of a 65 Mustang to have a restoration. And the reason that's important to me, and I think it's important, is because that word is used too loosely, where people do a planting on an old turf grass or crop field, and those are fine projects. And that's the other thing I don't want people to misunderstand. It's like we want people to do that. It's great stuff. We're doing some here. But it's not the same as the original. You will never have the biodiversity of an original. And we have so little of the original left, particularly in the state of Missouri, where there's less than half of 1% of our original prairie is left. We got to make sure there's a distinction between the real thing and something planted by people. Okay, huge difference. And the biodiversity is huge. So I make a big deal between what is a restoration and what is a planting, or an establishment, or reconstruction. There's different words you can use. I just simply like to call them plantings. This one kind of splits the difference because there are some natives popping up in here that we didn't put here, that have appeared through our management. So it's kind of a little of both. And the weird thing I've discovered since working in Kansas some and being around Kansas is I believe there is a lot of restorable prairie in Kansas, but we can't recognize it, okay? It's been grazed or it's been hayed or whatever for eons, who knows, but it's never been plowed because a lot of Johnson County is too rocky to plow, so it's never been plowed. But a botanist can't walk across it right now and look at visually what you see and say, oh, wow, look at this prairie, because it doesn't look like a prairie anymore, but it's still under there. But the only way you'd know that is if you started burning it or applying herbicide at the right time, or both, some things like that. And then you can see some prairie bouncing back there. I've seen that over on Johnson County Parks lands that Matt Garrett has been working on. There's spots like that, and I'm convinced there's spots like that right on this place that if you'd never guess there's prairie there, but if you start doing the right things to it, those plants are still hanging on.
It feels like you're sort of putting a lot of emphasis on it has been plowed or it hasn't been plowed. Is it because the soil structure?
Once it's plowed, it's done. It's not a prairie anymore, never will be.
So the definition of a prairie is not just the plants you see, but the entire structure.
Yeah, and honestly, the more important part of that prairie is underground.
Yeah.
It really is. And when you destroy that soil profile, the microbes that have those intricate interactions with the root systems of the plants, etc., we don't know how to put that back, put it that way. Basically, all privately owned prairies that are still in existence in western Missouri are hay prairies. I mean, that's what's kept them as prairies, because the landowner values them for hay. So they get cut once a year, every year, for who knows how long, and that's generally July or August. And they actually make for some of those most beautiful calendar prairies, we call them, the beautiful shots you see of the spring stuff with the Indian paintbrush and lousewort and phlox and all that good stuff. Because hay prairies really benefit those species. You're taking those things that have had a chance to complete their life cycle, and then you reduce the competition for that later season stuff when you hay. So the early spring stuff on a hay prairie is tremendous. We don't have a big spring component here, and that stuff is very hard to acquire in quantity by seed, generally speaking. So it's hard to put into mixes. When we started burning this, we just burned the whole thing. And in the last 2 cycles, we've burned half. This kind of maintenance road is always here in the middle, so we'd burn either that half or this half. Well, this year we wanted to mix it up a little bit and try a technique that the Missouri Prairie Foundation uses and promotes, which I think is really pretty cool. It's kind of labor intensive, so it's not for everybody, and I understand why somebody wouldn't, you know, particularly you're a private landowner, if you get the permission to burn and the equipment and the people to help you all at the right time, you're going to tend to want to burn the whole stinking thing, and I don't blame anybody for doing that. But what we're going to do here this year is we're going to burn this half. So we're kind of switching the compass direction here. And then the next year, what we'll do is flip it and probably burn that half. Well, we could do either one that way, we'll decide. But that gives you quarters where you're going to have a range of structure where you've got an area that hasn't burned had a growing season without a burn. You've got a place that's been burned 2 years in a row, and a couple areas that have been burned every other year. So you get a variance in the structure, and that's important, particularly where it can be. If this was a larger problem, I'm not going to claim we've got a ton of grassland nesting birds here, because a lot of them are size restricted. You're going to need 40, 50 acres or more to get, you know, a lot of dick cissels or Henslow sparrows or stuff like that. It's not impossible. We might not have some of those. But all those birds have they're very picky about their structure. You get a Henslow sparrow, it's got to have at least a year, maybe 2 of residual duff vegetation to nest in, or it won't nest there. Grasshopper sparrow, just the opposite. It's got to have bare ground to run around in. That's part of the reason prairie chicken biology is so tricky, because they need all this variation in structure, over a broad landscape, and that's just hard to replicate today. So birds need different structure. So you're providing that, but it's also with insects. If you burn every year, you're burning up a lot of insects. There's a lot of insects, particularly some of our pollinators, some of the little native bees. And people think of bees, they tend to think of what? Honeybees, which aren't even native. Or they think of things like bumblebees, which are like giants of bees, where they don't realize there's all these little native bees that are like 2-3 millimeters long. And some of those bees overwinter in the stems of plants. So they're not going to hold up the fire very well. We learned this lesson at Jerry Smith Park. There's a section of Jerry Smith Park. It's the best prairie out there over on the east side of the park. And we hired my good friend and colleague from St. Louis, Mike Arduzer, who's a Midwest bee expert, to come and do bee surveys there. And he found less diversity in bees on the east side of the prairie than it did on the west side. And the east side has more diverse flora. So I was like, I don't get it. Why doesn't it make any sense? I'd talk about it with him and he'd mention there were some very common genera of bees there that just weren't there. I'm like, really? That's strange. And the more I thought about it, it's like, what's different about this side of the prairie than over here? And one of the differences I came up with is when we burn this east side, it burns very hot and very thoroughly. So when we're done, it's ash. It's dirt and ash. It burns very hot. And I said, how many of those missing bees, I called him up one day, how many of those bees that aren't there that should be there are stem nesters or overwinter in stems? He said, I'm not sure, I'll get back to you. And he called me not long after that and said, yep, you're onto something there. And we were burning them up. And so it had less bee diversity there than there should have been there. So what we do from now on is we engineer some refugia into that burn when we burn, so we're not burning all of it. So by doing this, breaking this up the way we're doing it, we're supplying that so that we're not cooking all of our good pollinators and other species.
If you're watching this, you already know what you plant matters. But as Larry and Shannon have indicated, how you manage the landscape is just as important. Habitat Architects is a small but mighty team that stewards land across the region. We asked their team why native landscape restoration is important to them.
I'm Dayton Rains. I work with Habitat Architects. I think restoration is important because a lot of our natural communities have been upset throughout our history in America, and I think it's important that we sort of reconnect with those, reestablish them so that people for generations to come can see the biodiversity that used to exist here and hopefully will still continue to exist here.
My name is Ryan Bath. I'm with Habitat Architects. That's a great question. Why is native restoration so important to me? Really, I think for the most part, as you know, we kind of see cities sprawl a little bit more, we start to lose a little bit of that native aspect. So really just as little bit as you can, kind of bring that back. Then you kind of give little tiny sanctuaries or little islands for migrating birds, excuse me, for migrating birds or, you know, migrating insects like the monarchs. So, you know, and you're kind of appreciating the history of this country, which, you know, I think was built on those native things. I think people relied on that, and so did the Native Americans. So I think that's why I feel like it's an important thing to do.
Coming up next is our live Q&A session with Shannon Tyree and Larry Rizzo of Habitat Architects. Stick around and ask our guest experts your burning land management questions. All right. I'd like to go ahead and welcome back both Shannon and Larry to the virtual stage. Hey guys, how's it going?
Good. That was fun to watch while I'm staring out at snow and it's about 2 degrees. It was fun to see all that green stuff.
Definitely. Dina and I were talking about channeling that warmth from the September day that we spent out in Olathe together. So okay, you guys, well, we've got some really great questions here in our Q&A. And just to remind our audience members, if you have questions for Shannon and Larry about land management practices, go ahead and put it in the Q&A section rather than the chat so we can see those and answer them. And then also, if you all stick around towards the end, we do a pop quiz where you'll have a chance to win one of our Deep Roots bags that we had during our Planet Native conference. So be sure to stick around to the end. Okay. Right off the bat, Shannon, can you talk a little bit about buckbrush, what it is, and why are you all trying to remove that from the woodlands? Because we have a few folks in our audience that are wondering about it. They find it beautiful. What does it indicate in a woodland? Just give us kind of an overview on buckbrush and why you manage that.
Sure. It's kind of like a lot of plants. I'll even say that I know people probably are questioning on the hedge as well. It's a similar thing. They're still native plants, so you're like, why do you want to target them? The problem is that they unmanaged areas. They're good examples of areas that maybe be old pasture areas that have been abused, or the trees are removed at one time. It used to be ag and now it's not, or people planted of course hedge. But buckbrush in specific, it just becomes a little bit aggressive because of the lack of fire maintained in there, and then it becomes a monoculture. It allows no herbaceous plants at all underneath it, so that's all there is. I don't have anything specifically against it other than when it's waist tall and you can't even walk through it, you're losing a lot of diversity there. So we don't have any problem if some of it comes back, and it will. When we burn the first time, it'll grow back the first year after the burn, and it'll just be shorter. And then we burn again, and it'll tend to knock it out pretty good. So that's really the main reason. It's the same with the hedge. It displaces a lot of localized native plants that would otherwise be there. I don't have anything wrong with a specific hedge, even a cedar in the right place. But I certainly don't want 100 acres of all cedars for the same reason. So that's why we're kind of talking a little bit negative about buckbrush, is just because it was so intense that it had completely denuded the understory of this woodland.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to your goals, right? as land managers, you have specific goals for these different areas, not just habitat types, but in your case, what do the landowners want done in these specific areas? Shannon, could you give briefly another overview of your goals for managing both the woodlands and prairies out there in Olathe?
Yeah, I think there's a couple different types of prairies out there. One being, old pasture that we've restored, which is more of a hayfield, but we want it to be a natural grass hay with some forbs in it. So our goal there is that so that basically the landowner can utilize that and pay taxes. That's that's kind of an important. That's one of his goals, and ours is to make it as native as possible. But it will never be as diverse as the other prairie that we talked about. That was kind of where we removed the cedars. That was more of a remnant underneath, and it came back, and it's just extremely diverse. So our job there is just to maintain it so that the woodland cedars, buckbrush don't encroach, the bush honeysuckle from the edge that tries to encroach, and to keep that diversity as high as possible. Other parts of the property, the woodland burns, are to get it back as diverse as we can, of course, and then to restore that understory. There wasn't any understory other than the buckbrush, and now you could probably go through and pick out real quickly 15 or 20 different species that just weren't there. So each time we get a burn in, it seems to improve a little bit better. And so that's our goal, is to make it as good as it can be, as within reason and cost and time.
Makes sense to me. Yeah. Okay. So, Larry, this question's for you. Teresa asks, could a current planting, given enough time, ever create the soil structure, if that's the correct term, to be a real or remnant prairie?
It's a very good question, and it's really one we can't answer because none of us have been alive long enough. If you have enough time, is that possible? Perhaps, but it's not within our lifetimes anyway. So it's really an unanswerable question, I think, right now. If I could tack on to what Shannon said about the buckbrush, because that's a good question too. When we're trying to eradicate something that's native, people rightly have questions about that. But it's a very common sight particularly in northern Missouri. I think of it. Old degraded woodlands have a buckbrush gooseberry understory. And those are plants that they're grazing indicators. It's an indicator of a degraded woodland that's been grazed. And so those plants proliferate. They weren't consumed by the cattle when they were grazed. So they've really, there's a lot more of it there than you wish was there. And buckbrush, we should point out, is in the honeysuckle family and behaves very similar ways to the nasty exotic shrub honeysuckle in some capacity. It doesn't green up quite as early or do quite as much shading in some aspects, but it can behave that way. And the woodland out at the Dillon area, I think Shannon's understating it by saying it was waist high. I saw buckbrush out there chest high. It was the most vigorous buckbrush I've ever seen anywhere in my life. So we definitely had more of it out there than we wanted, and we will always have some component of it, and that's fine. But
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and thanks for adding to that conversation as well, Larry. Anonymous is asking, along with this discussion of buckbrush, can the gray dogwood tree become more of an issue as it appears to grow better than other native trees and restored woodlands near them? Any thoughts there?
I'm not sure I've encountered gray dogwood in a woodland situation like that. And I could see, I mean, the native dogwoods, and we have to distinguish, a lot of people hear dogwood, they think flowering dogwood, but we've got those other species, rough-leafed and gray dogwood, which can be quite aggressive, certainly on prairies, but I've not witnessed that in a woodland situation.
Perhaps more woodland edge?
Yeah, I could see that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And it's probably fine and appropriate for there if it doesn't go crazy on you. But
I think back to Shannon. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Larry.
I would just say it does require some sunlight. It's not going to grow in a closed canopy, more of a situation.
I was going to say in Shannon's comment about kind of your goals on this particular property, I'm sure it just depends on this particular landowner's goals as well, which will determine their management efforts. Sharon is asking, other than river oats, are there understory plants that have been successful once bush honeysuckle is removed? I'll shoot that question over to you, Shannon.
Yeah, we've also do Virginia wild rice seems to work pretty good. Um, Particularly those native plants that we use the river oats because we can collect it, and it is fairly aggressive. Some people might not want it in their system because it does get pretty aggressive in certain places, especially if it's a little bit more of a lowland. But we would rather have that to deal with than a non-native. So Virginia wild rye works pretty well. Those are the two we primarily target. We've used beet green before, but it becomes kind of expensive. Um, so those are the two that I would probably concentrate on. Basically, even a woodland brome you could do, but they're just so expensive. So between river oats and the Virginia wild rye, that's kind of where, and those two are pretty common in our area, and all the a little bit nicer wood, especially Virginia wild rye, they're going to be in every bottomland that we have around. Um, I think we use those, and again, it's mostly because of availability and cost. And I can't really think of anything else that you'd want to go in there unless you just had a really bad situation where you wanted to get some cover and did something like a cover crop that was only an annual. Um, but those are the two we typically stay with.
Yeah, that makes sense. Those are two really good options for fuel to carry throughout a woodland, as far as I understand. So speaking of fire, right? Is fire also a good tool for knocking back both blackberry and bush honeysuckle?
Bush honeysuckle for sure. It comes with some caveats, however. It generally requires burns, back-to-back burns, so more than one burn done within a 12-month period. So 2 successive falls or winter burns, you can knock back both buckbrush and shrub honeysuckle quite a bit. You got to be persistent with it. One of the other problems with that, where you have a bad honeysuckle infestation, you often don't have any fuel under there because it's suffocated all the ground flora, so there's nothing under there to burn. So you get this catch-22 where you really want fire in there, but there's nothing to burn, and you can't get rid of the honeysuckle. You do get fire in there, so it gets kind of tricky. You may have to manually clear it out, particularly if they're large plants. That's kind of an approach we've used in many places. You clear those out manually. You're always going to have a flush of young ones coming on, but that may give you an opportunity where you get some sunlight on the ground and get some fuel, and you can get fire in there. You got to put heat on them. So you can kill honeysuckle with fire, but getting enough heat on them to do that can be tricky. As far as blackberry, I'm gonna really hedge on that one because I don't know there's a big consensus on that. I can tell you there's one native prairie I'm very familiar with that was being burned annually, and it did seem to increase the blackberry on it. So I can't, I don't feel like I can speak knowledgeably on the effects of fire on blackberry. But we should keep in mind it's native, provided it's not the Himalayan blackberry, but it's native, and it's a good bee plant, good pollinator plant. So we don't want to eliminate a thing like that from a prairie, but it can get overly aggressive in places as well.
Fair enough. Yeah, I've definitely snagged my clothes on it many times hiking through the woods here throughout Missouri. Same with gooseberry. So, okay, John is asking, also related to fire. In our HOA, we have some rough areas that have been recommended to burn. The smoke is an issue for our residents. Would bush hog mowing be a better alternative if burning is not an option?
I would say yes, because the biggest reason HOAs are always a difficult animal because they're within a municipality. Municipalities will often be all over burning until you actually ask them permission. And fire departments then all of a sudden, fire departments, their job is to put fire out, not to let fire burn. So generally when you ask, they say no. Even out at the site that we were talking about here out near Kill Creek, we've had trouble anytime there's a new group of firefighters out there. Their first reaction is no. We have to pull out our maps, explain that we know what we're doing, and eventually talk them into it. So for that reason alone, if you can burn it, I think it's great. And there are ways to cut down on the smoke. We've brush hogged them in the past where they're a little bit lower. Pick a day in the evening, and if it's not big, if it's a half-acre area you're trying to deal with, pick an evening when you get your volunteers out there and you can light it at when it's short. Smoke goes straight up, and it's not that big a deal. Um, but you certainly can brush hog as an option. The only negative of that, I think, long term is not removing the thatch can be a problem over time. Um, but we certainly have encouraged, especially lately in the HOAs, because of the difficulty of burning, go ahead and knock it down.
Is there a preferred time of year that folks should do that?
We tend to knock it down in the winter now, when the dormant season, that seems to be the best time, unless there were, you can kind of curtail some of the height. So if you have a little native area that's all, say it's Indian grass and big blue stem heavy, which sometimes they are because they were planted with a CRP mix because it's cheaper. And so if that's what came up and it's head high or taller and you want to knock some of that down, you can go in the very 1st of July is a good time to knock it down. And then when it grows back, it's not so tall. It just looks better. But we typically do all of ours in the winter, and even our burns are usually late fall now, trying to encourage forbs more than the grasses.
We should emphasize, however, that if you mow honeysuckle, you're mass killing it. That way you're not able to put herbicide on individual stumps. It's coming back. You've reduced it, but you haven't done anything to eliminate it. So you're going to need a follow-up if you do that, be it either fire or coming back with an herbicide application, a foliar application, or something like that. So one shot of brush hogging, it'll look nice for a growing season, but if you do nothing else in a few years, you won't know you ever did it. It will just come screaming back.
True. Bush honeysuckle acts very much like a hydra in Greek mythology. You cut off one head, you get 10 that pop out. So perhaps
a world for nothing.
Yeah, perhaps a good approach would be herbicide, cut stump treatment, then maybe brush hog after. But of course, it always depends on the site and the goal. So. And for folks in the audience, we are talking about buckbrush or coralberry, not buckthorn, the invasive vine. I know those common names sound very familiar, or similar, but buckbrush is a short little shrubby plant that has a nice arching shape. It usually has pink little berries on it. We have some at the Discovery Center as a garden plant, which is also a host plant for the snowberry clearwing moth, which is very cute. But understandable why it's part of your management efforts to remove it from these woodland areas. So, okay, so we've got several more questions, but we're probably going to only be able to answer a handful more before we run out of time today. One other question on burning. Janet is asking if there is a minimum number of acres that burning would make sense. Can you spot burn small places, save it for big areas? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I know Larry's answer. He burns it around his house. And so do I. So it doesn't have, you can't get small enough. It'll burn. I burn individual prairie drop seeds around the house. I have a water hose when I do it, but yeah, I think you can burn any size.
Larry?
Paying attention, of course, to all local ordinances.
Yes, thank you for that disclaimer. Don't just go willy-nilly flicking a cigarette into your dry grass garden over there, please. Okay, Patty is asking about hedge. So we've already covered a little bit about hedge or Osage orange trees. Shannon, can you talk about are they native? And how do you keep hedge that you've girdled from resprouting without chemicals? Do you burn it right away?
Wow, that's a good question because we typically treat it when we cut it. But if you girdle it multiple times, we've had pretty good success with that, putting like 3 rings around, triple girdling it if you. In my experience, the ones in the woodlands don't tend to sprout back after that. The ones on tree lines do. I think it's a sunlight factor, I'm sure, with it. But we like to just burn them once they're, kill them. Treat that wound, if you will, that cut, and then hopefully get a burn in later. They are native mostly to, I think, believe southeast, south central more than they are here, but they've expanded as everything else has and kind of brought their way up. They had a purpose on fence lines. I mean, they were fence rows for a reason. They get so gnarly you can't get through them, and pioneers would plant them to keep their cattle in. It's a wooden fence. But there, as we talked about the others before, there's a place for everything, and typically in a woodland, a hedge tree isn't going to be your best friend because it takes up space that a more localized native would.
And Larry, oh, sorry. I was gonna say, also tell us who used to eat these fruits from the hedge trees, in addition to your answer.
Well, I don't know if we know that for sure. Maybe Pleistocene mammals at one time ate those things. There are some animals that will go after the seeds inside of the hedge balls, hedge apples. I kind of think it's a food of last resort, though. You typically see that like now when conditions are like this outside. Squirrels, rabbits, things like that, perhaps even deer. Um, how native Osage orange or hedge is a real matter of debate. We believe, I think more of Southwest Missouri it was, but Native Americans spread it around, and they like to use it to make bows out of. So if you know anything about hedge, it's flexible wood, but it's extremely durable and strong. So one of its names is Bodark, which comes from that. So it was used, it was valued by Native Americans, and then early settlement, as Shannon was talking about, for hedgerows, windbreaks, fence posts that don't ever rot. I mean, before there were metal T-posts, people used hedge posts to make fence. So it had a lot of value.
That makes sense. And it also provides really hot fires for your campfire.
That it does, burns very hot.
Okay, y'all, we're gonna pause real
Pop a
quick.
lot, so I
Oh, it
wouldn't
does.
recommend it for your fire. You're going to be on the news probably because it pops everywhere.
Yeah, don't put it in your wood stove. You might bust it, right?
Right.
Okay, folks, so we are going to do our pop quiz. So the rules of our pop quiz, for those who may or may not be familiar with our program here, is the first person to correctly answer this question to everybody in the chat. So make sure you have your chat settings just so everyone can see them. The first person to answer this correctly will be the winner of today's pop quiz, in which you will win this really nifty Deep Roots bag, which we were giving away at our conference last week, our Plant Native conference. It's bright enough where if you're riding a bicycle, it'll help keep you visible on the roads. Or also a very great bag for nature advisor visits, which is what I'm going to be using mine for. And today's question is, according to today's program, Larry Rizzo mentioned different types of habitats. What percentage of canopy cover defines a woodland? All right, folks, put that in our chat and we will see who the first person is. Wow, y'all are fast. Okay. It looks like Andrew Philla, you answered correctly, 30 to 80%. So congratulations, Andrew. I will be getting your mailing address and sending you this nifty Deep Roots bag. So congratulations. And thank you, everybody, for sending in your answers. Okay, so to finalize our wonderful program today, I would like to go ahead. I'm going to share my screen real quick. Okay, and then for our final Question. Sally's asking about this particular property in Olathe. Is it able to be visited on our own time? If so, can you share the location? And if not, do you all have other parks or local areas that you might recommend folks visit instead?
Well, this site is private property, so unfortunately, no, other than we do occasional workshops and field visits there through Deep Roots, for instance. Very nearby is Kill Creek Park, Johnson County Park and Rec, and there's a very nice native prairie there. So very close by, you can see a prairie.
And then I think, Larry, you also mentioned not quite nearby, but Jerry Smith Park is also a great one on the Casey Mo side.
Absolutely, out near Martin City in southern part of Kansas City.
Yeah. What about you, Shannon? Do you have any recommendations for places for folks to visit?
Those are the two I go to, is the one where we're working on. There's actually some others in town, but they're all private but commercial that we work on. A lot of commercial buildings that have a 3 to 5 acre native area on the side, and some of them are kind of coming around that they're just kind of scattered all over town. Um, Gosh, Jerry Smith's the place I'd go. I spent a lot of time at Jerry Smith, so it's a place to go real close.
That's
So
awesome.
I'm of course, former state employee of the state of Missouri. So this answer is Missouri centric, but if you contact the Missouri Prairie Foundation or get on their website, they'll have a list of all public prairies in the state of Missouri you can visit. So I would highly recommend that.
I was just about to say that and mention to you all, all of our viewers out there, following today's program, I will be sending you a resource document, which will include Missouri Prairie Foundation, Casey Wildlands areas, and other great resources for you to visit, local and regional conservation areas and natural areas. But for now, let's go ahead and thank both Shannon and Larry for their time and expertise today, as well as the rest of the Habitat Architects crew. We appreciate all the land stewardship you provide to our region, and thanks for joining us today at Deep Roots Native Plant webinar.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Very good questions from everybody today.
Yeah,
Yeah,
great
thank you.
questions.
Enjoyed it.
Thanks so much. Okay, now for our viewers, go ahead and join us for our next episode on March 6th, where we'll be exploring green roof gardens in Kansas City. Much like today's program, these are some private rooftop gardens that both myself and my esteemed colleague Chris Cardwell got to visit just a couple months ago. So we'll be exploring that in our next Deep Roots Native Plant webinar. So stay tuned and have a great rest of your week. Thanks so much.